Today, a little something different. We're going to talk Sony. I'm going to talk with Rick, who's a Sony shooter. A lot of you know that. He switched from the A1 to the A7RV, what, a year ago?
A year ago.
We'll check in on that. All right, so we're filming this on the eve of me taking off from Melbourne with the family.
Yeah.
I'm lucky to be joined by my good friend, workshop coordinator, amazing photographer Rick LePage. And I thought we'd talk a little Sony stuff.
Yeah, you have no camera.
I don't have. I used to have an A6500 and an A7S, but yeah, no. Let's
Well, and your ZF is packed away.
My ZF's packed away. Yeah, the Z9 is. I could pull it out, but it just looked like a big. Why is that here?
Yeah.
So let's talk Sony.
Yeah.
You switched from the A1, which you loved. I shot a fair bit with the A1. I remember being really impressed with it in Palouse.
Yeah, I loved the A1. It was a great camera. But
A year ago.
A year ago, so a little bit over a year ago, Sony announced the A7R5, which the big hype for it was 61 megapixels. The A1 was 50.
Right.
I actually really liked that resolution. But there were a bunch of things in the R5 that kind of made me go, why isn't there a firmware update for the A1 that will give me focus stacking, for example? And so I made the decision. I did an even swap actually, my A1, which was in great shape, and bought the A7R5. And I wasn't sure, you know. I mean, the A1 viewfinder and that shutter, it was just amazing. The electronic shutter was just nuts.
And like the Z8 or the Z9 Blackout, shooting action, really fast frame rate, all that stuff. Yeah.
But you know, the reality is as much as I like going out and shooting birds in Charleston or bears in Glacier, I'm not really a wildlife guy. Right. You know, I really am. I'm more of a landscape photographer and street.
Yeah.
And you know, there were a bunch of things in the A7R5 that really got me going. One was the focus stacking. You know, you guys have had in-body focus stacking for a while.
Focus shift shooting, Nikon calls it. Yep.
And
quite a while actually.
Yeah. And
and then they retroactively added it to the old cameras via firmware.
Yeah. And you know, that's the type of thing where it was like, okay, the A1 is going to get superseded by the A2 or the A1 Mark II or whatever they're going to call it.
Sure.
And that's going to be another $7,000 camera, and I'm not going to be able to afford to swap that. And you know, the A7R5 really felt a little bit more like the type of camera I wanted, and there were some things about it. Yeah, I was actually very apprehensive about the 61 megapixels. I'm like, I'm doing fine with 50. I don't really need 61. But one of the real surprises for me, which happened during the Charleston workshop, was I started using David Archer's old trick of going into DX or APS-C mode, as they call it on the Sony, when we were shooting birds in flight, and it was crazy.
Yeah. I
mean, it was nuts how great it was. I mean, just framing. And
well, I think that's the thing people don't really realize. You know, it's with the DSLR mindset. You think, well, I'm just cropping in on the sensor. What good does that do me? But when you're shooting smaller subjects that are a little further away, like you wish you had an 800 when you only have a 100 or 400 or 600, and you go into the APS-C or DX mode, it crops in on the sensor, but it blows that up full viewfinder.
Right.
And you're seeing things larger, you're seeing those decisive moments happen bigger in the frame. You're able to really, because you're going to crop to it anyway.
Well, with the 61 megapixel sensor, I'm getting 26 megapixel APS-C shots. And, you know, I walked away from the Charleston workshop thinking, okay, I can live with this. And the other thing so the highest frame rate on this is 10 frames a second. There's like I think a 6, 8, and a 10. And every time I shot 20 frames a second with the A1, I spent way more time going through and getting rid of images that I ended up shooting at 10 frames a second most of the time when I was doing burst mode on the A1.
I shoot mostly 10 frames a second when I shoot burst mode with the Z9. It's only for hummingbirds or birds in flight where you might want the wings just right, you know, and then it's a lot to work through.
Yeah, and again, like I said, I like when I'm out there doing it, but that's not what I chase.
Yeah.
You know? And the other thing, and the thing that I thought I was going to miss most about the A1, and I do, was the blackout, because you get blackout on the viewfinder with this.
A little bit, right?
A little bit, yeah.
It's not like the Z6. Where
no, not at all.
Yeah.
But the thing that's what really kind of, when I walked away, you know, it's like I'm seeing all of these guys during this workshop, you know, with Z9s, right? And they're all like, you can't even hear them shoot, right? And every time I'm standing next to one, I'm going, ka-choo, 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 ka-choo. And I was like, oh yeah. But you know what? I got the shots.
Yeah.
I got the shots that I wanted. Yeah. It was not that hard to deal with.
I'm going to go back in time. It was before you were workshop coordinator. You were still on one in it. And I was out with David and DC, our good friend DC. And DC showed up with the original Sony A9. And David had his brand new D5. And he's like, a man's camera. And I had like the D500. And I was, you know, I might have even had the Z6 with me. I was going to Cuba afterwards or something. And I was, it was early in my mirrorless evolution. I had fallen in love with the viewfinder, but not the autofocus. It was before they really made the autofocus better with firmware. And DC's like, you know, you're not going to believe this, you know. And I picked it up and I'm shooting birds, and it had a little box drawn around the bird, and it's chasing it through this really bright viewfinder, and it's just making this little fluttery like sound. Yeah. And he goes, that's just digital. I can turn that off. And it was like, it just, and it was shooting, I don't know, 20 frames a second, which seemed insane at the time. And I handed it to David, and you know, David, we did a little, I think I have a video. I'll link right here. I have a video from that particular trip. I'll put it up there. I'll put it in this video's full description. But you know, I took David's D5, and it was like a howitzer. You know, you're like, and it was like 12 frames a second, which was amazing for a DSLR. And it was accurate and tracking with its dynamic area autofocus, but then you use DCs, and there's a little box following the bird and following it right up towards you as it flies at you, and it's like a little fan, and then I handed it to David, and I was like, huh, you know, and David took it, and he goes, wow, I gotta admit, that's something, you know, and so and you watch from then to now. I mean, it was that moment, I think, me falling in love with the way that I could see the world so bright in that viewfinder. Even as the world got dark, I continued to see it bright, and I could adjust the diopter. It all happened at the same time as I started needing reading glasses, and I could just adjust the diopter instead of getting my reading glasses out of my bag and zooming in on the back LCD. I could just look through the viewfinder, zoom into 100%, scroll around, then go and change menu settings without getting my reading glass. I was like, oh, this is pretty sweet. And then I saw DC's ability to track on the sensor, and I thought, wow.
Well, you know, so the A1, that was sort of the breakthrough, at least for Sony, in terms of autofocus tracking. And it was the best. I mean, I was coming from, I think I had the A7RV, which I had for a couple of years, and which had decent tracking. But the A1 was like night and day. I mean, it was just crazy. And the great thing is that the A7R5 has all of that tracking in here. I mean, it's still got the great eye autofocus, all of that stuff. So I got that. I got to keep that, and that worked really well in Charleston. And then when we were in Glacier,
well, it's like the ZF. The ZF doesn't have the megapixels as the 9 or the speed, but it still has that tracking too. And I love it. It's like it's gotten so good.
You know, and I mean, there little things. You know, you learned with the ZF. I watched you with the, you know, this, you know, fully articulating display.
I love the
and it's wonderful. And you know, it was like this summer when we were in Glacier and I was setting up some landscape shots. This was really nice to be able to sort of have be on a tripod and just sort of get that look. You know, it's great for when you're shooting down low. So I really like that.
Not to mention that right now, if you bump this into something, it's not going to damage the screen. I love the protective nature of it. You're not going to scratch your LCD.
You know, and there's some other things. One big thing that drove me crazy in the A9 or the A1, and I know for a professional sports or wildlife action photographer, it was essential. But you had a drive mode button right here.
Yep.
And which was fine, but it, you know, it was like locked, and you know, if you wanted to, I mean, there were a lot of modes,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But the thing that happened with the A1 was, I was so used to when I had used my user modes 1, 2, or 3 that everything, when I set up user mode 1 for action, and I set the drive mode to be 10 frames a second, you know, on the A1, I'd have to manually go in here and set it on the drive dial. Whereas with the A7R5, every one of these settings has every setting I created in it, and I just love it.
Yeah.
You know, it makes me use the user modes more than I did with the A1.
Nikon, you should listen to that, because sadly, even in the Z9, drive mode is not included in the banks. The banks are not sticky, they're bookmarks. There's a lot of things Nikon could take a lesson with user modes from Sony and profiles from Leica that they really have thought through a more complicated computer-aided camera, making ways to make the settings easy for you to flip.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the A7R5 feels to me just a much better thought out version of the camera from Sony.
Yeah.
You know, and I could see this being my main camera for another couple of years. You know, I mean, the A9 III with its crazy global shutter, it sounds cool, but it's, again, it's like an updated version of the A1 in some senses.
Well,
you know, it's smaller megapixels, but it's a
very specific tool.
Yeah.
It's for people who focus on action, and we have questions about that camera's dynamic range. I'm seriously curious about finding that out. Yeah,
I am too.
I think there may be a couple of sacrifices in getting that global shutter. I think it's the future.
Yeah, I agree.
I think it's the future.
Yeah, I think we're
but it may be the first version of the future.
Yeah. Well, we were talking earlier. This has been, you know, I do think we're kind of at an inflection point where, you know, we've got these autofocus systems that are just crazy. You know, I mean, it's just nuts to think we're doing things that we couldn't even do 6 years ago.
Oh yeah.
You know, and I think that, you know, things like ISO and dynamic range. You know, we're taking these holdovers from the film days. You know, but 800 ISO and 6400 ISO are, you know, I'm getting great shots.
I am too. It's insane.
Most of my shots from Cuba were 6400.
Yeah.
And they're just wonderful. So.
And the you know, we talk a bit about the second base ISO. It's not really so much a second base ISO as this level in their gain, right? I mean, it really is. Only so much light comes into the sensor. You're not making the sensor any more sensitive to the light. You're working with how you amplify that signal that it receives. And so, you know, if you're working in lower lit situations, you need to amplify the light more to make an image. And in that process of amplification, you get distortion, just like you would with the stereo if you have a poor set of speakers. And they change how they do that at a certain level. The very bright light scenes are designed to capture more dynamic range at the expense of noise. And then they hit a certain level, and they're worried more about reducing noise than gathering in dynamic range in lower lit situations. So they change the equation, and there's some level where that hits. And for me, with the ZF and with the Nikon Z6, all those 24 megapixel bodies built on that sensor, that's at 800 ISO. It's a cleaner image at 800 ISO than it is at 200 ISO. And so if you start understanding that, you know, it's pretty amazing. And plus with the noise reduction software that we have now, that's why people, you know, when they scoff at getting an f4 zoom, a lighter weight, wider range, like the 24 to 120 instead of getting the 24 to 72.8.
Right.
24 to 72.8 was really essential when 800 speed film was really grainy.
Yeah.
Now you can take a 10,000 ISO image, and if it's exposed well, this is a key, if it's exposed well, you can run it through Lightroom's denoise or DxO's pure raw or ON1's no noise or Topaz denoise and get a really clean, I mean not perfect, but really clean, an image that looks like it was shot at ISO 400 4 years ago. And so all of a sudden, unless what you really need is a shallow depth of field, that 2.8 isn't nearly as important as it used to be.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
So,
It's
cool stuff. It's funny. I had Tony over this morning, our friend who's an amazing photographer of boats on the river around here, and just a great guy. And I was talking to him. He's a Sony shooter, and I said, "Oh, it's a bummer. You're going to miss Rick. Rick's not getting here till after you have to go, and you could talk to another Sony shooter." And then he got into talking about how much he loves his A7R5. And I thought, well, Tony, didn't you have an A1? He goes, I did. He's a UK guy, and he's like, but when I bought the A7R5 because I thought there were things, in it that really appealed to me, and I had both, and then I realized that my A1 was just sitting on the shelf, and the one that I really felt more in sync with was the A7R5.
Yeah.
But he said, again, it's like Rick. He's not out shooting sports. He's not out shooting wildlife as his main and primary goal. He loves landscapes and ships on the river and the crew of the ships, and it's a different kind of shooting experience. He doesn't need all that speed. And he said he felt like he was driving an F1 car when he wanted something a little more luxurious for what he likes to do.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I agree with that. That was talking about the mode dial, the drive mode dial on the top. That felt to me after a while like an anchor for my shooting, but I could also see how someone who was out doing action or wildlife, they want that because they want to be able to go from 20 frames to 10 frames to whatever,
It's interesting. So it's one of Nikon's Achilles heels to me. I mean, is there both user modes in the lower end cameras and banks in the upper end cameras. And on the Z8, they have a button for drive, and you can push it and run the command dial to change drive mode. And on the Z9, they have a hybrid thing where you have to push a lock button and turn it from single to high speed low to high speed continuous to to timer mode to multi-selector mode, where then if you push the button on the crown, the back dial controls all of those settings. And yet, in neither camera is that incorporated in a menu that's included in the user settings or the banks.
That's crazy.
So you can set a bank up to be action-oriented, and you literally still have to push the drive mode and select continuous high speed after you enter it.
Yeah, that's kind of what it was on the A1.
And yet, to prove that they could do it, they have this crazy thing on the Z9 and the Z8 called the user. What is it?
You're asking me?
Custom function hold button.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you can touch that button and program all kinds of parameters that it instantly flips in the camera, and one of them is drive mode. So I can flip to a mode instantaneously with a button that puts me in a high-speed drive mode and a fast shutter speed and all the things I want for. But they don't put it in the user mode. The minute I start changing any other setting, it goes back to where I was before, and I lose it. Anyhow, so that's great. And
and this, for years, I've been shooting Sony since 2012 when I bought the RX1, the little rangefinder camera. And the one thing that I would say that Sony really did not do a good job on was the interface early on and customization. They got better with the A7R3.
Well, and weather sealing and build quality too back in the day.
This is even more customizable to me than the A1 was.
And it's cleaner.
Yeah, it is cleaner. It's a great camera.
Yeah, I know you love it. I know Tony loves his too, and I've talked to a number of other people who love them. And I was a little skeptical of 60 megapixels in a sensor too. Partly, who needs all that resolution in most cases? And then secondly, the noise I was worried about. But I have the Q3,
right?
And the Leica Q3 is also 60 megapixels, and I'm blown away by what this latest generation of sensors can do with noise. I mean, I find that camera does a beautiful job at high ISO. And also the croppability. I mean, with that camera, you're locked to 28 millimeters.
Yep.
And so I can crop to my heart's content. I can crop into half of the frame and have a beautiful, usable image. So,
a lot of my images from Cuba that I shot with this, I ended up cropping them in. you know?
Why not?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So
No, I'm so glad that you love your decision here a year down the road. And you know, you talk about Blackout, but I just have to say, I mean, it's probably in shooting this just a tiny bit, and the ZF, the Nikon ZF, they're not blackout free like the Z8 and the Z9, but they're more like a DSLR, which is not that bothersome.
yeah, I found, I mean, I tried shooting in burst mode with the A7R3, and it really was not fun.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it felt like old school DSLR, you know, with mirrors flapping and stuff.
Yeah.
And this, you know, when I was out there shooting in Charleston, you know, I was able to track birds.
Oh, you had great shots.
Without any trouble at all.
Yeah,
you know, and you know that was when I remember walking away from Charleston because I think in the video we did last year I was like, that's going to be my test. You know,
we talked about it. Yeah,
I said, you know, because it's real easy to get used to not having any blackout when you're shooting.
It is.
You know, and it's like that's okay. I love to have a camera that has none. Yes, I would.
Yeah.
But this camera is just perfect for me and the shooting I do now.
That is awesome.
So.
All right. Well, there's a little bit of one more. Well, if there's one thing you'd have Sony change, if there was one thing you could have them change, and all, you know, just across the board, not necessarily in this particular camera, is there something they should be doing that they're not?
Well, I think they need to take stock of what Nikon does with firmware updates, and they need to be better at that.
Yeah.
I think they're doing a pretty good job. I've been, you know, I've got, you know, part of my journey through photography this year was primes, playing with primes.
Oh man.
And I got the 35-1.4 and I've got this 50-1.4 G Master lens, and I think their lenses are just amazing.
Yeah. Everybody's killing it with lens design
you know,
right now.
yeah, exactly. And you know, they've got the 50-1.2, you know, which is very similar to the Nikon one. It's big, you know, and heavy, and it's beautiful.
Yep.
But this 1.4 50 is great.
That's a wonderful size.
I mean, it's you know,
well,
it's not your Voigtlander 1.0, which
but it autofocuses too.
Yeah, it does autofocus.
It autofocuses too. I like that it has an aperture dial.
Yeah.
You know, I got an email shortly after I did the ZF review, and I was talking up the Voigtlander 50-1.0, and somebody was like, "Well, you know, how come you're not comparing that lens to Nikon's 50-1.2?" And my response was, you know, the 50-1.2, that's a great lens.
Yeah.
I've shot with it. I've shot, you know, Alex's and I've shot a number of people's, and I love it. It's a beautiful lens, but it's huge. It's big. It takes a lot of space in your bag. It takes like like you need to consider like you're packing the 100 to 400, and then if you point that at a subject where you want to blur the background and have their face big in the frame, that's a lot of lens to be pointing at somebody if they're not a professional model. They're like, whoa!
Yeah.
You know, it's intimidating.
Well, I had, when I was shooting Canon back in the day, the 5D Mark 1, 2, and 3 days, I bought the 85-1.2 and the 50-1.2. You know, both gorgeous, wonderful lenses. But I rarely took them anywhere.
Yeah.
Because they're big and heavy.
Yeah.
You know?
I love a couple of 50s that I have. I really like my 50-1.8. It's small, it's sharp, it's clinically beautiful, and razor sharp.
Yep.
But I love the 50-1.0 from Voigtlander because it has a special character. I don't think it's as sharp as the Nikon primes. It's not surgically as sharp, clinically as sharp, but it has this image rendering.
It's like the magical lens. It's like the Leica lenses. You know,
It
there's
is,
something a little magical about, you know,
the way it renders contrast and color and out of focus details and a little bit of vignetting that's actually really attractive. And so that I will say that I have most of my life shot nothing but zooms. You know, that it's easy. You go in a kit together to take somewhere, you throw in your zooms, and my zoom kit is still my primary kit. But I always have a prime with me these days. And
me too.
I love my primes.
I was getting ready to cut this video together actually, and I realized, oh, we forgot to talk about something that I thought is interesting in the Sony versus Nikon and other brands too world, which is the CF Express A card that Sony goes with. And you know,
it's been tough for me watching you guys with your CF Express B cards, which are cheaper
and faster.
Yeah. You know, but the reality is that CF Express A, I mean, you know, on the A7RV, we're talking 61
Megapixels.
Megapixels, right? You know, and I go into burst mode, and yeah, I can't fire as fast as you, but I could just go till the cows come home or the battery runs out.
Right.
And it's writing 61 megapixels to the card.
Which card's that?
This one, well, I've been shooting with Sony cards because for a long time those were the only ones there.
Right.
You know, and then Lexar just came out with, so the Sony cards, 160 gigabytes, are
Little.
$400. Lexar just came out with the silver line of compact flex CF Express A cards, half the price, $200.
Man, it seems like it's fast.
They are just as fast as the Sony Toughs,
All right.
and they rock it.
Well, I'll put a link. We're going to put a link to the A7RV and some of Rick's
Yeah.
favorite lenses, and I'll put a link to this card in the video's full description too. So,
But
well, cool.
yeah.
You know, I think the reason that the CF Express A cards cost more money and fewer people are making it is just that, you know, the only brand using it really is Sony for their high-end cameras.
Yeah.
And I think they might run into trouble. You know, the CF Express B has 2 bus lanes, so it can be twice as fast. And I think, you know, Nikon's chosen to go that way because of their 8K raw video.
Yeah.
Which,
Well, and you know, the A1 does 8K.
does it do raw though?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
If it does ProRes.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know why they. I mean.
Yeah. I've never felt that I've had an issue with CF Express A and writing.
Yeah.
And just I hadn't even really tried like ultra burst mode with the A7R5 but I mean literally the camera and the card keep up.
Yeah.
Literally till you run out of either space on the card or you run out of battery.
That's like me with the Z9 at the 20 frames per second with the Cobalt cards.
Yeah.
I guess it just seems odd because Sony's the one who originally came up with CF Express B for their high-end video, and I guess they're just differentiating, segmenting.
It's hard to
odd.
tell.
It is
but
hard to tell.
like I said, it's the one thing that I've been kind of like,
Well, but Sony's had a long hit with, remember the memory sticks, and they have their own proprietary kind of, it's nice Lexar's making cards for cheaper for you.
Yeah, and it's fast.
Cool.
All right. Thanks, Rick.
You got it.
Everybody stay safe, stay creative, have fun, enjoy family. We'll see you next week.